Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast. Spring is here. I don't know if I've ever been as excited about the warmer weather coming in. This winter has felt really long, which is strange because I was away for 4 weeks of it in the Northern Hemisphere in Canada, where it's not necessarily hot, but they were going into summer. So I don't know, coming back to being in the thick of winter and then having a few months of that has felt, really long. And I think here in South Australia, we didn't really get much of a hot summer last year. So anyway, the warm weather's here and I am excited. I know lots of other people are excited. It's the end of those pesky winter infections that I know so many families have been dealing with. But the downside of spring for so many families is those spring allergies, the hay fever, which can really cause havoc with a lot of children. So I wanted to talk today about the 3 things you need to know if your child struggles with hay fever. So, hay fever is more than just those, a bit of sneezing and a bit of nasal congestion or a runny nose. It can be really irritating. Anyone who has experienced hay fever knows that it can really affect mood and overall well-being. But the key symptoms of hay fever are things like sneezing, nasal congestion, runny nose, itchy, watery eyes, an itchy back of the throat. There's often an exacerbation of asthma in kids that have asthma. It can lead to some headaches, those sinusy type headaches. And a lot of kids with hay fever also have a flare-up of eczema because of that sort of allergy link. So it is not fun. And to come out of those winter infections into those symptoms of hay fever, really does seem a bit unfair. So, of course, the mainstream treatment for hay fever is just take an antihistamine. And antihistamines can work, really well for some kids and some adults. But there are some other things that we want to be thinking about. And I'll talk a bit more about antihistamines as we go. Look, there's nothing wrong with taking antihistamines to improve that sort of day-to-day quality of life. But what you do need to know is that antihistamines are not addressing the underlying cause of what's going on when it comes to those spring allergies and hay fever, which essentially is the immune system overreacting to the exposure to things like pollens and grasses. Look, there can be other environmental substances involved in hay fevery type symptoms. We know that kids that have allergies to animal dander, cats and dogs, for example, often also suffer with sort of that exacerbation of their symptoms in the springtime. Dust mite allergy can be linked with all of this as well. Yeah, it's not fun. So these tips that I'm going to be sharing can definitely be, translated and really helpful for kids with other environmental allergies. But what we are focusing on in this episode is, those spring allergies with the increase of, pollen count and grasses, those symptoms sort of being present, particularly in that springtime. Of course, they can happen year round as well, depending on, the particular sensitivities and what grasses and what pollens. But yeah, it's a very fitting time to talk about this with spring being here in the southern hemisphere anyway. If you're listening in the northern hemisphere, you're going into autumn and it's probably not so much of an issue. So the first thing I want to talk about, the first thing you need to know is the gut, the link between the gut and allergies, particularly the gut microbiome. Now, I can't talk about the gut microbiome and allergies without mentioning the hygiene hypothesis. So, there is a huge increase in the amount of allergies present within the Western population. And here I'm talking about, the allergies we're talking about, like hay fever allergies, but also food allergies in general. Allergies in general are on the rise. And there's no clear reason as to why that is. The closest thing we've got is the hygiene hypothesis. And the hygiene hypothesis states that exposure to bacteria early on in life is helpful for proper immune function. And when things are, like they are in the Western world, where we are obsessed with hygiene and kids unfortunately aren't getting the exposure to as many different bugs as they did in previous generations because of our, obsession with hygiene and keeping things clean and sparkling. This is having a negative impact on the immune system. And essentially the immune system isn't learning how to respond to harmless substances within the environment, pollens, grasses, and also foods as well. So what we need to know as parents is that exposure to different microbes is a good thing. So we want our kids to be playing outside more. And, this is one of the big factors in the hygiene hypothesis. Kids are spending way more time indoors. They're not getting exposure to different microbes like they do in an outdoor environment, in an indoor environment. And that is having a negative effect on their immune development. So, exposure to microbes in the environment is a good thing, and getting outdoors is a really good way of doing that. We know with this hygiene hypothesis that kids that grow up with pets and kids that grow up with older siblings are less likely to develop allergies. And so, the thinking behind this is that exposure to older siblings and pets gives kids exposure to more bacteria, more microbes that helps their immune system develop. So bacteria and exposure to different bacteria and microbes is a good thing. And it's one of the things that is thought to be impacting the huge increase in allergy prevalence here in Australia and in the Western world generally. I do have a specific episode on the hygiene hypothesis that I will make sure is linked in the show notes, so you can have a listen to that for a bit more info on the hygiene hypothesis. And I wanted to talk, specifically about some research that's been done in Canada. So there's a huge research study going on in Canada called the Child Study. And this particular study is researching children from birth, I believe, and, tracking children through the years. And researchers are examining, I've got the number here, 1,115 children who are tracked, from birth to age 5. So roughly half of the children had no evidence of allergies at any time, while more than half were diagnosed with one or more allergic disorder in that time. The researchers evaluated the children's microbiomes from stool samples from 3 months until 1 year of age. And these stool samples revealed that there was a particular microbiome signature, they're calling it, or bacterial signature, that was associated with the children developing any of the 4 allergies by age 5. So, hay fever was one of those 4 allergy kind of presentation. Food allergies was in there. I think eczema was in there, and maybe asthma was in there. So the bacterial signature that they're talking about that was kind of revealed in these children that did present with allergies by 5 years old is defined as dysbiosis. And I've talked about dysbiosis on the podcast before. It's basically an imbalance in the gut microbiome. And so this dysbiosis results in a compromised intestinal lining, otherwise known as intestinal permeability or leaky gut, and also elevated inflammatory responses within the gut. So we know kids that get allergic diseases are more likely, and this study is sort of showing that, to have dysbiosis, an imbalance in the gut microbiome. And so this is the first thing I want you to really focus on. And look, there's some specifics we could get into, but it really is, I want to make this really helpful for as many families as possible. So there are certain strains of bacteria that in probiotic supplements, for example, that have been shown to specifically help that immune regulation and decrease that allergic activity within the immune system. But I think for the majority of people, what we need to know here is that microbiome diversity, so lots of different good bacteria species within the gut microbiome, is protective against dysbiosis or imbalances within the gut microbiome. So that's really what we want to focus on. And so we want to make sure that there's lots of good bacteria within our kids' gut microbiomes. We can do that by encouraging them to spend more time outside, encouraging them to eat lots of fiber in their diet, lots of plant foods, lots of variety in their fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds and whole grains. And also by eating things like fermented foods, a range of fermented foods and drinks. Keep trying with those fermented foods. They're not always easy to get into kids at a first try, particularly if they're not used to that kind of sour taste. But there's so many options now. You don't have to just go for a plain sauerkraut. You can find sauerkrauts, for example, that have some apple mixed in with them, or you can make one. We have a red cabbage and apple sauerkraut in our club recipe bank. So if anyone's a club member and listening, make sure you look that one up. There's also things like coconut kefir or milk kefir, that you can really easily make at home or purchase from farmers markets and things that can really help with the diversity of the gut microbiome. So focusing on a healthy gut microbiome is really important for kids with hay fever and other, allergic conditions. That is number one. The second thing I want you to know if your child has hay fever is that vitamin D levels really matter. So vitamin D is a very important nutrient, sometimes sort of more known as a hormone, that is important for both immune strength, so really important for, keeping our kids healthy against those winter infections. But vitamin D is also really important for immune regulation. And so any child with any sort of allergic condition, food allergies, hay fever, eczema, should be thinking about, their vitamin D levels, or the family or practitioner should be thinking about vitamin D levels. So there was a study, I'll make sure that the studies that I'm talking about are linked in the show notes, where the results showed that children with allergies had lower average vitamin D levels compared to healthy children. And also that when children were given vitamin D supplements, they had less severe allergic symptoms as well. So this is, I think, really relevant when it comes to hay fever, because spring is obviously at the other end of winter. And depending on where you live, how close to the equator you are, how cold it is, how much time your kids spend outside during the winter, and generally, these things will all impact their vitamin D levels, and a lot of kids are vitamin D deficient, particularly at the tail end of winter, where the sun has not been as strong. They may not have been spending as much time outside. And of course, the vitamin D is dependent on our exposure to sunshine. So again, another vote for getting kids outside and making sure their vitamin D levels are adequate. Of course, there's this fine balance between sun safety and healthy vitamin D levels. And so you definitely want to keep an eye on the UV index, because things like sunscreen and covering up, all the things we do for sun safety, will negatively impact the vitamin D levels that a child will get in terms of time outside. So we want to it is a fine balance. And I talk to my kids about looking up the UV index. I mean, my kids are now teenagers, so they'll go out and about with their friends, and our rule is look at the UV index. If it's lower than 3, you don't need sunscreen generally. If it's higher than 3, we need to think about some sun protection if you're going to be outside for long periods of time. But yeah, knowing that that sun exposure is important to vitamin D levels and is a consideration with kids with hay fever is important. Of course, we can look at vitamin D supplementation as well as that sunshine exposure for improving vitamin D levels. And so that is an option as well. Look, for most kids, 400 to 500 IU of vitamin D a day taken in supplement form is going to be beneficial. Some kids might need more if their vitamin D levels are low. The only way to know for sure is through a blood test. So that is always an option. You can request a blood test for vitamin D levels with your GP and get those assessed by a naturopath or someone who is looking at optimal ranges as opposed to just the reference ranges that the doctors might recommend, because they are at the lower end. And of course, we can certainly help with that at Natural Super Kids. We have, full consultations online with our practitioners, but we also have express consultations. So if you've got some blood tests back, you want to know what they mean and what supplements are recommended based on that particular blood test, that's something we can help with in an express consultation. And we can also help with the best probiotic supplement for a particular child, because that really is dependent on the child's overall health status and health picture, as opposed to just looking at one symptom like hay fever or one condition like hay fever and saying this is the best probiotic for you. It really is best to have a look at that particular child's overall health picture. So we've got the gut microbiome is important. We've got vitamin D levels are important. These things are not going to help your child's hay fever symptoms today. So I did also want to talk about a more symptomatic approach that also helps to support immune regulation. And herbal medicines are my favorite modality, I guess, for both of these things. So there are some fantastic herbs that we can use that have some antihistamine actions, but they're also working on supporting that immune regulation. So they're looking at addressing the underlying cause of what's going on, as opposed to just stopping that histamine reaction. So pharmaceutical antihistamines work by blocking histamine receptors generally in cell membranes. So they're working in terms of preventing the body from reacting to the histamine that's been released because of that allergy reaction. Whereas herbs kind of go that step before, and a lot of the more antihistamine herbs will work more to stabilize mast cells so they don't release the histamine in the first place. And they also work on, regulating the immune system. They're anti-inflammatory. They help to reduce congestion. They're often antioxidants and bronchodilators as well. So I want to just share a couple of my favorite herbs that can work really well for symptomatic relief for hay fever, but they're also, addressing some of those underlying factors that lead to the allergic response in the first place. So the first one is albizia, and this is spelt Albizzia. Sorry, ZIA, not double Z, just ZIA. So albizia is a fantastic herb for that mast cell stabilization. So mast cells are a type of white blood cell that are a part of the immune system, and they're involved in the body's response to allergens and infections. They play a really important role when it comes to the body's inflammatory response by releasing various substances into the blood, including histamine. So that histamine causes the symptoms of inflammation, including things like itching and swelling, and some of those other hay fever type symptoms. So albizia works to stabilize mast cells so that they don't release so much histamine, which is a great thing. Albizia is also anti-inflammatory. It helps to reduce congestion. It's an antioxidant, and it's a bronchodilator, meaning it dilates the bronchioles in the respiratory system. So it can work really well for those kids who have hay fever as well as asthma. So that is, probably my top herb when it comes to hay fever. The other herbs that I really like, Bakel skullcap is a great one. It inhibits the release of histamine from mast cells and also has anti-inflammatory actions. Look, often you can find albizia and Bakel skullcap together in a combination. And I also love the medicinal mushrooms like reishi, and there's some others as well that work really well on supporting that more healthy immune regulation. They're like reishi is antihistamine, it's anti-inflammatory, and it has those immune modulating effects. So they can work really well as well. And as I said, there's nothing wrong with using pharmaceutical antihistamines if and when needed. But I guess the important thing is to know that you can be working on some of these underlying factors, the gut microbiome, the vitamin D levels, supporting immune modulation with herbs, as well as getting symptomatic relief from antihistamines, for example, if and when you need them. Herbal medicine, can really be effective enough for some people. Other people, it doesn't quite kind of do the trick. But then there's, pharmaceutical antihistamines that don't work for a lot of people as well. So, yeah, these are the things that I think are most important to know when it comes to hay fever in children. Of course, we are here to support you. We have online consultations available with our practitioners if you feel like you really want to get your child, the full picture looked at and a treatment plan sort of put together for them, as well as support from our practitioners, which is super helpful. I also wanted to mention our free gut health ebook. I'll make sure the link is in the show notes so you can go ahead and download that, and that gives you some really good practical advice for how to improve your child's gut microbiome and the diversity of their gut microbiome through things like diet, environment, and lifestyle. So that's a really great resource for you if your child has hay fever. I hope this has been helpful. Please reach out if you have any questions about this episode or any feedback. You can reach out to us on Instagram. And we also now have a little send text message, I think it says, in the show notes of our podcast episodes. So you can actually send us a message that way as well, which is a handy little feature. And if you prefer, you can email us, jessica@naturalsuperkids.com. All of the links are in the show notes for this episode. And I hope it's been helpful. Thanks so much. I will be back next week with our next episode. Have a great day. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.